Welcome to our Facebook Live event. My name is Johan Schmatzis, and I lead a team here in Johannesburg, South Africa, of 5 public diplomacy professionals. Our purpose at the Africa Regional Media Hub is to connect journalists with senior U.S. government policymakers and officials to discuss a wide variety of topics. I want to thank our journalist colleagues for being with us today, and thank you for the important work that you do. Today, we will be discussing equity and inclusion in the media in Africa. And this moment is particularly opportune as we just marked the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day just last week. I want to mention a couple of remarks recently made about this event. UNESCO dedicated the anniversary of World Press Freedom Day to independent, pluralistic, and diverse media as a necessary key to the enjoyment of all other human rights. Secretary of State Blinken remarked that, among other challenges, journalists face discrimination, censorship, and weaponized justice systems. Those observations give us a lot to think about as we move forward with our discussion today. So today we have 2 distinguished speakers joining us: Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, Desirée Cormier-Smith, and Special Advisor on International Disability Rights, Sara Minkara. Desirée Cormier-Smith leads the Department of State's efforts to protect and advance the human rights of people belonging to marginalized racial and ethnic communities and to combat systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. Previously, she served as a senior advisor in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs, as the senior policy advisor for Africa, Europe, and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundations, and as the senior director with Albright Stonebridge Group's Africa Practice, where she advised and assisted private and social sector clients on growth strategies across the African continent. She holds a BA in political science and psychology from Stanford University and an MA in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Special Advisor Minkara leads the U.S. Department of State's comprehensive strategy to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities internationally. Prior to joining the Department of State, she founded and served as CEO of Sara Minkara LLC, which promoted authentic leadership and value-based inclusion. Special Advisor Minkara is a graduate of Wellesley College and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. So we will hear from each of our speakers, and then we'd love to hear from all of you. So please share your questions with us in the chat. I have a few questions that have already come to us submitted in advance. But please feel free to share more questions with us in the chat. We want this to be an interactive session, and we'll try to address as many of them as we have time for. So at this time, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Desirée Cormier-Smith, Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. Ms. Cormier-Smith, could you talk to us a bit about your role in the Department of State and share with us the importance of the media in advancing the rights of historically marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities in Africa?
Sure. And thank you for having me. It's so great to be in conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Sara. I always love when we get to do things together because I learn so much from her. So I'm really excited for this conversation. So my mandate is new. I've been in this role for a little less than a year now, and I was appointed last June by the Secretary of State as the department's first ever Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. My mandate is twofold. First, to ensure that U.S. foreign policy programs and processes promote and protect the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent, and to build global partnerships to combat systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. To be clear, my mandate was not created because we think we have solved these challenges in the United States. I want to be abundantly clear about that. On the contrary, my mandate was created because we acknowledge that while we are grappling with these challenges, we are not the only country doing so. We very much see racism as a global scourge that will require coordinated and sustained global solutions. And so about your question about the media, the media can be a very powerful force for good or for bad. And in many countries in the world, the media, like other institutions, have been predominantly male, and predominantly of the dominant racial caste or ethnic class, right? And so that means that for far too long, people belonging to marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities have been locked out of those structures. They've been prevented from accessing media structures where they can tell stories, and they can tell their stories, and they can tell them from their perspectives. That is critical. When we have a media that looks like the diversity of whatever country we're in, whether it be in South Africa, the United States, or any other country in the world, when the media reflects the diversity of the population, you will have a more fulsome, more accurate description of what's really going on. However, when the media doesn't reflect the full diversity of a country, you will only have a half of the picture, if not, if not less, right? You'll only have one perspective, one side of the story. And then when there are stories told about marginalized racial, ethnic, or indigenous communities, they're not necessarily told from their own perspectives. And so it's really critical that media looks like and represents the countries in which they're working. And that, again, will lead to better outcomes and would lead to more accurate understanding of what's really going on in the country.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And you mentioned that we in the United States are still struggling with these issues ourselves.
Indeed.
That led me to wonder, how do you think the U.S. media is faring in terms of equity and inclusion? And do you think that, are there any important milestones or steps that we've taken in our history that you think advanced these causes? And are there any tips or resources or best practices that you could recommend for our audience today?
Yeah, well, we have made progress, but we're not perfect, and we still have so much further to go, right? I think we have seen a growing recognition of the need for diverse voices to tell diverse stories. I think the positive thing, if anything, that came out of the horrific murder of George Floyd in 2020 was a renewed discussion and a recognition by a lot of Americans that maybe didn't acknowledge the challenge before, of the reality and the persistence of systemic racism in our country, and indeed around the world, because we saw peaceful protests around the world following the murder of George Floyd. And the conversations about media representation, whose stories get to be told, who gets to tell those stories, were part of those conversations in 2020. And I think have led to an increased awareness about the need to ensure that diverse people have access to media outlets and can tell their own stories, but also how we're interrogating whose voice is heard, right? Whose narrative gets to dominate. And in many ways, social media has been a great equalizer, because it has given people from diverse backgrounds access to tell their stories, right? I think one of the most hopeful things that I like to point out in terms of media representation and how far we've come in the United States is the story of Issa Rae, right? Issa Rae is a Black creative from LA who, didn't see her friends represented in the popular media. And when she saw Black women represented, we were always represented in a stereotypical, often negative way. But that's not who she was. That's not the story, that's not what she knew. And so what did she do? She started creating her own stories, and she was able to publicize those stories on YouTube, on social media. And they got so popular because it resonated with people. People were hungry for these kinds of stories that depicted regular Black people living regular lives. And it's since grown, and she's now a media mogul, right? She has an HBO empire. It's really fantastic. So I think that's one example of how much progress we've made. But until Issa Rae's story becomes the norm and not the exception, we have work to do.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all a lot of stuff to think about there. Thank you very much. So next, I would like to introduce Special Advisor Minkara, our next speaker. Special Advisor Minkara, could you tell us a little bit about your role in the Department of State and share with our audience what does disability inclusive media encompass, and how is the media a critical tool for changing the narrative on persons with disabilities in Africa.
Amazing. Awesome. I just want to first thank our colleagues for bringing us together for this really great dialogue. And I want to echo what Desiree said. I'm always really happy and excited whenever I'm with Desiree. And I also want to thank my amazing team that really carries this work forward. So I'm going to answer this question backwards, actually. So before I answer and talk about what my role is and what we do, I want to talk about, the latter part of the question. So I'm going to ask the audience that's listening in and participating, and thanks for everyone that's participating, this question. When you think and see a person with a disability, let's say walking down the street with a white cane or wheeling down the street with their wheelchair, what comes to society's mind in general? I want you to take a second and think about that. And what comes usually to society's mind is the following. On one hand, people see persons with disability either through a lens of pity, charity, I feel bad for them, they're suffering, they're struggling, fear, grateful I don't have this, different, add-on, and so much more, right? That's really our very common one side of the narrative. Or the other side of the narrative, which is, oh my God, they're so inspiring, they're so brave, so courageous. And we call this in the disability world, inspiration porn. Society yet hasn't, and I'm using the word intentionally, normalized the identity of a disability as part of our society from a lens of value where we expect them to be out and about in society, going to schools, having jobs, having families, etc. Right? That is the common narrative. And that results in leaving behind the 1.3 individuals in the world with a disability, 1.3 billion, 16% of the world's population. And that will manifest in so many different ways. And some of you might be familiar with this. It will manifest in communities and cultures that will see albinism as people that are cursed, and that results in witchcraft and getting them hunted and killed because they think that they will be able to live longer if they use their hair or their body parts and put spells on. Or that will result as well in getting women with disabilities either sterilized, or the chance of domestic violence is 3 times greater, or abuse and neglect. Oh, that will also result in babies that are born with disabilities not being registered because of the stigma. And when you're not registered, you don't exist, you're invisible. And that is all because we are seen through a lens of pity and charity and less than. And this is where media plays a big role. And is where our office, as the U.S. Special Advisor on International Disability Rights, where we work on advancing the rights of persons with disability across the globe, including the Africa continent. One of our main priorities is we need to disrupt the narrative. Because when we disrupt the narrative surrounding disability, we move from a charity lens to a value-based lens. It's going to result in society demanding and holding countries accountable to the disability policies and laws and legislations. And media plays a huge role because media can either perpetuate the charity narrative if we start using words like suffering, disability, or I feel bad for them, etc. Or we can turn it around and we can have media actually get society to hold governments and countries accountable to say, we demand the inclusion of persons with disabilities because when we don't, we're losing out on their value, their innovation, our economies are hurt, etc., etc. So media plays a huge role in making sure that society thrives and we're tapping into everyone's potential.
Thank you very much, Special Advisor. I just had one follow-up question, if you don't mind. You shared with us before today's live stream the names of a few leading voices of Africans with disabilities. I'll just read those now. Eddie Ndopu from South Africa, Jean Nzao from Republic of Congo, Ramla Mohammed from Kenya, and Sinikwe Katamanga from Zimbabwe, as well as the participation of organizations of persons with disabilities. So what are your thoughts on engaging with reporters or editors, members of the press, to help them better understand the role they play in changing the narratives surrounding people with disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, reporters and journalists, the media world has so much power to make a difference in disrupting the narrative. And it's in a few different ways. We talk about persons with disabilities face exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, all of that. But in order for us to really disrupt that reality, first, let's make sure that the media world, when we're talking about disability, we're talking about it from a value-based lens. Let's make sure the language comes from a value-based lens. Number two, let's be comfortable using the word disability. You know, a lot of people want to use the word, well, special needs, and I will say, well, I'm blind. I can tell sighted people, you have special needs, right? You need light. I don't need light. It's all about how we phrase it. Some people want to use the word differently abled. Why? Are we all, differently abled? Like, ultimately, I'm blind. I'm a person with a disability. I cannot see. I want you to not erase that from me or ignore it or create an elephant in the room, but I want you to actually change how you look at my disability. So let's be comfortable using the word disability, but let's also make sure we're bringing forward persons with disability from a value-based lens. Let's tell the story how we bring value. Let's also make sure communication tools are accessible across the board, whether it's accessible through captioning, through audio description, through simple language, all of that. But then let's also make sure our media world has representation of persons with disability. I want you to ask the question, is disability represented in our human capital when it comes to the media world? I also want to make sure that disability can be invisible. A big portion of the disability community is invisible disabilities. And lastly, there's a phrase in the disability world, nothing about us without us. Let's make sure we have disability voices when we're talking about disability. But I say, let's take it a step further, nothing but without us. Bring the disability voice and perspective into all conversation from a value-based lens. We're not there just to talk about disability issues. We're there to talk about everything. So this is how the media world can really play a powerful role in disrupting the narrative.
Thank you very much, Special Advisor. That was very inspiring and also thought-provoking for all of us. So that's a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that. So at this point, I'd like to go to the interactive part of the program, which I'm sure everybody's been looking forward to. I would like to go to some of the submitted questions that we have. So first off, to kick off things, Paula Frey of the Frey Media Foundation and the first female editor of the Saturday Star, as well as a Nieman Fellow who's based in South Africa. She asks, what strategies can media organizations adopt to promote diversity and inclusivity in their workplaces, specifically ones that address the issue of implicit bias and systemic discrimination in their reporting and editorial decisions? And Special Representative, I think that this would be an excellent question to get your thoughts on.
Sure. Well, actually, this is really not my expertise, right? I focus on fighting racism in our foreign policies, right? So fighting structural racism through U.S. foreign policy. And at the State Department, we're really lucky to have a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer that focuses at what is at the heart of this question. How do you create workplaces that are diverse, that are inclusive, that are equitable, and that are accessible to people from all backgrounds? And so it's really important for me to always acknowledge that DEIA is really important, but it's also broader than just race, right? DEIA is also a diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility for women and girls, for persons with disabilities, for LGBTQI plus persons, for persons from various religious backgrounds, right? As well as those from marginalized racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so this, I would actually love to throw this to our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, because she is hard at work at doing just this at the State Department, making sure that the State Department has a workforce that reflects the beautiful diversity of America.
Right, and thank you very much for pointing out the A in DEIA.
Of course.
And I think that's extremely important. So perhaps the Special Advisor has some thoughts on the question of workplace inclusivity.
I definitely want to echo what Desirée said, and and I'll talk from a more of a personal experience as an employee, for instance, and in any workspace. I say, when it comes to disability and accessibility, first, accessibility is more than just infrastructure, which infrastructure is super important, right? The technical infrastructure, accessibility needs to be there. We need to understand, we need to create universal design. but also accessibility is from a cultural perspective, where we are eliminating those implicit bias. When it comes to disability, I always say we need to be having those difficult conversations where we're actually addressing what people truly think about disability. Until we have those difficult conversations, until we hear what people are really, how they really see the disability, we're never going to address, disability inclusion fully. And then also, we need to create a space where we allow people to share and we understand the barriers that we each individually face. There are many layers to barriers. How do we eliminate those barriers? How do we journey map? How do we understand that we need to create a space that is accessible, inclusive for all? And then when we do that, we don't see it as an add-on or a burden when we create a system that's accessible for persons with disability. It actually benefits everyone. Take curb cuts, for example, that were originally created for wheelchair users, but who benefits from them? People with strollers, people with suitcases, the Amazon delivery guy. So let's make sure that when we look at accessibility, it's not an add-on, it's not a burden, it's not a favor, it will benefit everyone.
Thank you very much, Special Advisor. For our next question, I'd like to go to someone who I'm sure would agree with all of the comments that you just made. Jacqueline Waiharu, based in Nakuru, Kenya. She's the founder of Safe Haven Spaces, a women with disabilities-led organization to help young people with disabilities get into or stay in school. And Jacqueline asks, do you feel inclusivity in the media is growing? And if so, what are the reasons behind this increase?
I mean, yes, it's growing. And when we were in Mozambique last November, I was able to do actually a couple of visits to Mozambique and Nigeria. I met this amazing company in Mozambique that's founded and led by persons with disability, which is really, really great. I was really impressed. I think there's so much more work to be done around inclusivity of disability into the media world, across narrative, across language, across representation, across making sure the communication accessible across the board. So how do we do more of that? I think when we start really showcasing that when we are making the media accessible, inclusive of disability, it brings value to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So for the next question, we have a fascinating question from Judy Kaberia, investigative journalist and co-founder of a women in media advocacy group in Nairobi, Kenya. So Judy asks, Kenya recently celebrated the election of women in the roles of president and vice president in its National Editors Guild. Fantastic. That is fantastic. How can these women leaders best leverage their role to make equity and inclusion a reality for more newsrooms in the country and in the region?
Yeah, well, congratulations. I think that's fantastic. Though whenever I hear the first in 2023, I'm a little disappointed, right? It shouldn't have taken us this long to overcome and break down these barriers. But congratulations, that is a huge milestone. I would say that, having women in these positions and women who care about other women will be important because they bring their lived experiences to this role, right? And I hope that they use this power and their representation to open the doors for more women, to ensure that people from all marginalized communities have access to these spaces so that they can tell their own stories. And when we have people tell their own stories, we'll have a better picture of what's actually going on in society, and everyone benefits from that.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Can I just add just one thing as well? I mean, this is super important, and I want to add from the perspective of women with disabilities. When I travel the world and I talk to women with disabilities and I ask them, how much is the women's rights movement inclusive of women with disabilities? And a lot of time it is not inclusive, and it's not bringing in the women with disability into the fold of things. So my ask will always be, when women leaderships are really brought forward, how do we ensure that we're also bringing to the table women with disabilities and really understanding those perspectives?
Yeah, if I can also just add to what Sara said, it's such an important point, right? Because we know that people can be multiple things at once. And I am a woman. I'm also a Black woman. That means I face discrimination because of the fact that I'm a woman, but I also face discrimination because of my race, right? And so we cannot ignore the fact that people can face multiple and compounding forms of discrimination because of those multiple identities. And so when we take a one size fits all approach and we say, you know, oh, we care about women, but we're not being inclusive of what women look like, and including women with disabilities, women from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, women who are trans, women who are LGBTQI+, right? Women who are from various religious backgrounds, then that feminism is not big enough for all of us. So I really want to just echo what Sara says.
Thank you. And that's an excellent segue to our next question, because we have sort of touched on the rights of LGBTQI plus persons. But we do have a question that goes directly from that. And I'm happy to see that the question comes from a source in Uganda. So Rizdel Kasisira, senior reporter at the East African Center for Investigative Reporting in Kampala, Uganda, has a question. Some media houses have given less attention or negatively reported on the concerns and rights of certain groups like LGBTQI plus persons because of negative societal beliefs toward these groups. We see these groups running away from their areas to seek refuge in areas or countries where they feel safer because of the negative media coverage. How best can a pluralistic and liberal media in Africa interact with the conservative, traditional, and religious beliefs in order to promote equity and inclusion? Fantastic question. I'd love to hear from both of you on that. Special advisor?
Yeah, Sara, do you want to start?
If you want to start, you can go ahead. But if you...
Sure. This is a tough one, right? And I think, you know, the reason why I am a little hesitant to fully lean into this question is because we have another colleague who focuses specifically on the rights, the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons. She's phenomenal, Jessica Stern, and we were just remarking before we went live that we wish she were here because the three of us like to do these kinds of conversations together because we represent marginalized communities. And the reality is, unfortunately, the communities that we serve continue to be the most marginalized and vulnerable across societies around the world. And the reason why we do our work is because we firmly believe, the Biden-Harris administration firmly believes, that when you protect the human rights of marginalized communities, of persons with disabilities, of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, of LGBTQI plus persons, everyone is better off, right? And it's also going to the fundamental core of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that every human being is born free and equal in dignity and rights. There's no asterisk to that. There's no asterisk that says except LGBTQI plus persons, or except people of African descent, or except persons with disabilities. It's every human being. So by virtue of being a human being, you are free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, we know that in the 75th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, that is still, unfortunately, an aspiration. It's not yet true for all people. But I would encourage the journalists, the media online, to don't be afraid to call out the truth, to make that statement true, right? One of the things, my aunt is a journalist, and one of her role models, and has since now become my role model, is Ida B. Wells, who was a courageous Black woman in the height of the terror of lynching in the American South. Yet she was unafraid to tell the story of how innocent Black men and women were being lynched for the smallest of transgressions, or even the accusations of a transgression, right? And it was Ida B. Wells, her courageous work and her telling of the story and truth telling that really turned the nation's attention to this horror. And I think brought necessary attention and resources to address this challenge. And so I would just encourage all of those out there to remember Ida B. Wells.
So the theme that I'm picking up from you is courage.
Yes.
That just comes to mind.
Don't be afraid to tell the truth.
Special advisor.
Yeah, I mean, Desiree, that was beautifully put. And you know, to your point, Desiree, this is where freedom of press is super important. This is where the media plays a huge role to make sure we hold societies and governments accountable. We need the media world to keep on bringing those voices forward, because if we don't have that, then there's human rights violations that will keep on happening, with taking into consideration that we need to sometimes, when we are talking about certain issues that might put people's life at threat, we need to be very careful. So I would say always hearing the communities and their perspective and their voices and how they want to bring it forward into the media world is really important. But media needs to continue bringing these issues forward. And then just on the disability issue, I would say disability almost has the other challenge where we're just invisible, we're not seen, right? And we are a double-edged sword. We're not a controversial issue. No one will ever disagree. Disability inclusion is okay, great, but no one really sees us. And this is where I say the media world also needs to step up on that front.
All right, fascinating. Thank you. I'm absolutely loving these very to the point questions that we're getting. So we have a question from Emmanuel Towson, who asks, having institutional laws to back people with disabilities and to cater for their welfare and educate them should be the focus in Africa. Have you, and Special Advisor, I think this goes especially to you, have you had contact with African governments? And if so, what's your impression about the infrastructure on the ground for equity and inclusiveness?
Really good question. So first, yes, laws, policies, legislations is super important. For me, if I did not have the benefit of the ADA, the American Disability Act, I was born and raised in the US. I became blind at age 7, but I continued to be able to go to the public school system and live my life very much fully. And that's because, one, I had laws and policies and legislations that protected my right. But then two, as important, I had the narrative of value, where my parents and some of my teachers and my community said, you know what, you're going to embrace your disability. We're not going to allow society's expectations or lack thereof when it comes to disability ever enter your home. You're going to have ambitions and dreams. That narrative is as important. So when we take that to the government level and the country level, yes, we went to Nigeria and Mozambique, and in both countries we engaged with government folks. And in Mozambique, actually, we were focusing on providing technical support on a disability policy that they're trying to pass. That's super important. We want to make, disability policies to be aligned to the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, that most countries have signed and ratified. But then also, how do we hold countries and governments accountable? Because sometimes laws and policies are there on paper, but we need to implement. Who implements? People. So we need to really get society and people to see the value of the inclusion of persons with disability. So as important is narrative change, as important is working with folks from the media world, entertainment world, and other sectors that really influence narratives.
Yeah.
Special Representative, you're here on an official visit.
Yes.
And so you are you're doing what your mission is, which is to engage with those foreign governments, with African governments. So do you have any comments on your visit so far, or the question that we just got?
Yeah. My mandate is to engage with governments, but just as important as engagement with governments is engagement with civil society. My work is hard, right? Because racism is truly a global scourge, but it looks very different in every single country in the world. So I cannot apply a one-size-fits-all approach to this work. And so in order for me not to do that, and in order for me to not apply an American lens to the problem, which I'm very careful not to do, I have to start by listening to the communities, right? So as important as government meetings are, civil society engagement often is even more important for me, because I need to talk to the people. I need to talk to members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities and hear directly from them, because they know better than anyone else the challenges they're facing, the barriers they're facing, and then what they need to overcome them, right? They simply have just been excluded from the rooms where the decisions are being made. So I lead by listening. I lead by learning. And then I try and figure out how we can draw on partnerships to support these communities and work with governments on addressing a lot of these shared challenges. Again, I really want to emphasize that I don't engage in this work thinking that the United States has all the answers or that we have solved racism. No, I engage in this work with great humility And I approach this work in the spirit of partnership. And I've been very successful in engaging with governments that are also struggling with challenges of racism, because we can engage in a dialogue. We may have good practices and success stories from the United States to share with them, but they also have best practices and success stories to share with us.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we have another question, and we are going to have to be wrapping it up pretty soon. We have another question which is fascinating because it touches on the sort of economic angle and the facet of poverty. So Bulus Hunzar from Nigeria asks, in Africa, poverty prohibits almost half of the population from accessing the media and social media. What strategic approach can we take in Africa in combating strategic discrimination and strengthening inclusion through the media, again, with that eye on economic conditions and poverty? So
Sarah, do you want to?
Sorry, what did you say, Desiree?
Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
Sure. I mean, this is a really important question, right? And I would also add another layer to this when it comes to disability. My question is, how much is social media and media also accessible for persons with disabilities, right? So that's another layer. How do we make sure people that are deaf or hard of hearing are able to access certain communication, or blind or visually impaired, et cetera? So ultimately, we need to really understand local context and local communities and see how narratives really are brought forward. And when I'm looking at the disability context, it's media, it's social media. For us, it's also families and parents. They're the first narrative influencers in terms of what narratives they bring forward into the household. Local communities, local schools, local teachers. How do we make sure that within the education world, we're thinking about the right narrative when it comes to disability inclusion? It's across the board. It's an ecosystem of stakeholders within the system that we can come in and say, let's make sure we have a value-based narrative when it comes to disability inclusion. And within that, we are also wanting to disrupt the narrative that, ultimately, when we exclude persons with disabilities from our economy, for instance, it's estimated, and I think it's more than that, to be honest, but it's estimated that our GDP is impacted by 7%, for instance, right? So how do we really think of creative ways where persons with disabilities are integrated into local education and the job force? Sometimes people say, well, this is very much costly. Inclusion is costly. No, actually, a lot of times you can see communities that want and see the value in the inclusion of persons with disabilities. They'll find creative ways to make it happen, right? It's all starts from the point of how much do I see the value in this? So it's an ecosystem, and I would want to always look at where are narratives created, and how do we really integrate into that? Desiree?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I add to that. That was such a good response, Sarah. I think I would just emphasize one important point that she made at the top, which is it really depends on the local context, right? Are we talking about neighborhoods and communities where radios are accessible, where people listen to radio programmings? If so, how do we get more informative and inclusive and diverse voices on radio programming so that people can be informed about what's going on in their countries? Is our newspapers more commonly read, right? So it really does depend on the local context, and which is why, in order for these approaches to be effective, they have to be community-led and community-driven.
Fantastic. Well, our time is unfortunately limited in this event, as in all of our events. But speaking for myself, I can tell you it has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope that our participants have learned a lot. I'd like to ask if our speakers have any final words before we wrap up today.
Thank you for having us. This was really great. I hope it was informative and useful for those who joined. I guess I would just leave you with two examples of how the media can be particularly powerful, and how they can be used as a force for good and a force for bad. So during the height of the COVID pandemic, in the US, we saw a proliferation of anti-Asian bias and hate perpetuate itself on social media. And then we saw journalists pick up on those same kinds of language and derogatory terms, and how we describe the COVID-19 pandemic, its origins, and then Asian Americans. What was that result? real harm on Asian Americans in the United States. We had horrible instances of hate crimes, of violent attacks on Asian Americans for simply being Asian Americans. And so that is one example of how the media can really be a power for negative things, for evil, essentially. On the flip side, one good example of how the media can be a force for good is that one powerful hashtag, that Say Her Name hashtag. And that was driven out of part of the Black Lives Matter movement, but it was a recognition that Black women were also being killed, also unarmed Black women being killed at the hands of police, like Sandra Bland, like Breonna Taylor, but they weren't getting the same level of attention as Black men, like George Floyd, like Ahmaud Arbery, like so many countless others. And so the Say Her Name hashtag, which began on social media by Black women, began to call attention to the intersectionality that Black women were facing as a result of racism and sexism. And as a result, we saw more reporting on issues impacting Black women. And that's a really good example of how the media can be a force for good in drawing attention to things that otherwise would have never gotten the necessary and needed attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Special advisor?
Desiree, these are really two beautiful examples. Thank you. And I just want to say that two things. One is we all as humans, as individuals across the world, have one common thing that we share, right? The desire to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued. And I want you to think really, truly on that point. We all share that. Let's make sure that we're seeing and we're hearing the voices, and we are valuing persons with disabilities. And my last point is, I want you also to take forward this concept, nothing without us, nothing without persons with disability. We should be everywhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to thank once more our two speakers for being with us today, for the generous time that you've given us today. And I think that your time and your commitment and your energy really underscores the importance that the United States government attaches to these issues. And so thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion. I hope everybody else enjoyed it and got a lot out of it, as did I. So as with all of our events here at the Hub, we will prepare a resource document for participants, and we'll include all the valuable information that was shared today, including a recording of the event and a transcript. We'll post that later on our feed. Please, everyone, stay in touch with us. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter as well at Africa Media Hub, Facebook at US Africa Media Hub, and stay in touch with us by email at afmediahub@state.gov. So wishing everyone a fond farewell. Thank you for joining us. So long and be well. Goodbye.
Thank you.